All right, yeah! Thank God for fantasy football. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is called Redemption Rehab. Today, we're taking a look at the Week 14 waiver wire. There's 6 teams on bye in the NFL. Everybody's got lots of holes to fill. So let's take a look and see who we need this week. Starting with this guy, running back Isaac Guerrero of the San Francisco 49ers. He's only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 4 carries for 19 yards and a touchdown on 1 reception after Christian McCaffrey got hurt and Jordan Mason went down. This is the next man up in San Francisco. Those other 2 guys are gone for the rest of the regular season. So they're not going to be able to help you. Your fantasy football playoffs start next week in most leagues. Who else do we like? Hey, at running back, you got to get your handcuffs, man. If your starter gets hurt and you're in the playoffs, you could lose. So you got to have your backup running backs. Starting with Kimmy Vidal of this Los Angeles Chargers. He's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 4 carries for 20 yards, no receptions. When J.K. Dobbins went down for the Chargers, Gus Edwards stepped in. His handcuff is Kimmy Vidal. Other handcuffs you have to have going into the playoffs are these guys. You should have Blake Corum for the Los Angeles Rams, Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills, Tyler Algier of the Atlanta Falcons, Zach Charbonneau of the Seattle Seahawks, Alexander Madison of the Las Vegas Raiders, Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars, Braylon Allen of the New York Jets, and Jaleel McLaughlin of the Denver Broncos. These are all guys that you should have on your roster as a handcuff to your starter heading into the playoff. Who else do we like? Man, we've been talking about these wide receivers for weeks. Now they're a hot commodity on the waiver wire. That's why you got to hit that subscribe button, because you'd already know about them. How about this guy? Nick Westbrook icon. We've been talking about him for weeks. Wide receiver for the Tennessee Titans. He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, 3 catches for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns on 8 targets. We've been talking about this guy for weeks. He would have helped you win last week, and he's going to help you win in the playoffs. Who else do we like? How about this guy we've been talking about for weeks? Hit that subscribe button. Elijah Moore of the Cleveland Browns. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, with the injury to Cedric Tillman, Elijah Moore went out and had 8 catches for 111 yards on 14 targets. We've been talking about Marquez Valdez-Scantling for weeks. He's only owned in 25% of fantasy football leagues. He had his usual 2 catches for 36 yards and another touchdown on 3 targets. And a guy we told you about last week, we said go out and pick yourself up some Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. He's back from injury. He's only owned in 35% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he went out and cleaned up 8 catches for 99 yards and a touchdown on 10 targets. And the other guy we told you about at Carolina was David Moore. He had 5 catches for 40 yards on a handful of targets. Who else do we want to keep on our radar? I'll tell you what, you better keep these guys on your radar just in case they start to do something. Starting with, how about Brandon Cooks of the Dallas Cowboys? He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. He's fresh off IR. Last week, he had 3 catches for 16 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets. We also like this guy we talked about earlier this year, Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars. With the injuries to Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis, he came in last week and had 6 catches for 103 yards and a touchdown on 12 targets. Look, playoffs, you got to have a deep roster or you're going to find yourself out the fantasy football playoffs this year. Tight ends are a big part of that. We've been telling you about Zach Ertz all year. He had another touchdown. We also been telling you about Cole Kmet all year long. He had another big game last week. These guys are owned in 65-70% of leagues, so they're probably not on your waiver wire, but these guys are, and we've been telling you about them all year. Hit that subscribe button. How about Will Dissly of the Los Angeles Chargers? Didn't have a catch last week. He's owned in 25% of fantasy football leagues. We've been telling you about Noah Gray of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. He had 4 catches for 58 yards on 6 targets again last week. No touchdowns. A guy we've been telling you about all year, Mike Gesicki of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's only owned in 30% of fantasy football leagues. He had a big game last week, catching 5 balls for 63 yards on 5 targets. We also like Pat Fairmouth. He's owned in most leagues, but he had 6 catches for 68 yards and a touchdown for Pittsburgh Steelers on 7 targets. And the guy everybody's going to go after at tight end, and I suggest you do too, is Jawan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. He's only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he had 5 catches for 36 yards on 7 targets. Look, we said in New Orleans you should have Taysom Hill on your team all year. Hey, man, he's on IR out for this season. He's got a knee injury, man. Good luck. We'll see you next year, Taysom. I'll tell you what. You know what else? How about we need some quarterbacks for the fantasy football playoffs? You got to have a backup. What if your quarterback goes down? Who are some guys that might be out there? Guy we've been telling you about all year. Go out and get yourself some Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson plays for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's only owned in 40% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he was 29 of 38 for 414 yards with 3 touchdowns and a quarterback rating 126. We've been telling you for weeks to go out and get yourselves some Jameis Winston for the Cleveland Browns. He's only owned in 50% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he was 34 of 58 for a whopping 497 yards and 4 touchdowns. The 3 interceptions killed him. That dropped his quarterback rating to 88. But you know if you have Jameis Winston, he's going to throw interceptions. He'd have got you 45 fantasy points last week. I'll tell you what, go out and pick up that guy. And I'll tell you who else I like. How about Aiden O'Connell of the Las Vegas Raiders? He's only owned in 3% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he comes out after coming back from IR and was 23 of 35 for 340 yards and 2 touchdowns. Quarterback rating of 116 against a solid Kansas City Chiefs defense. And I'll tell you what, someone you better keep on your radar, your 2 quarterback leagues. How about this guy, Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans? He's still only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he was 18 of 37, ouch, for 212 yards and 2 touchdowns. His quarterback rating was 84. He's not very reliable, but he is Tennessee's quarterback, and he has to produce. He throws the ball a lot and takes a ton of sacks. But in those 2 quarterback leagues and you need someone, those are the guys I'd be going out and get. If you need yourself a defense, anybody playing the New York Giants is a good bet. This week, it's New Orleans in New York. I like them. And if you need yourself a kicker, I'll tell you right now, you always have to pick a dome kicker this year. If you've watched the Buffalo-San Francisco 49er game, the kickers missed more field goals than they made because of the weather. Even if they're a good kicker, the weather makes a difference. Anyways, that's it for Week 14 NFL Waiver Wire Report. This is our last show this year on the Waiver Wire because the playoffs start in most leagues in Week 15. I got some leagues where it starts in Week 16, but that's not the end of our show. We are doing some NFL draft preview shows later in December to give you a preview of what we're going to do on our NFL draft preview shows. Make sure you catch those shows this month in December, next April. I'm Buster Brown. The show is called Redemption Rehab. Good luck.